Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I do know for a fact there are some people from Australia, so good afternoon, evening for you as well. So I just wanted to let you know that we're going to begin this session in 1 minute, okay? We're just allowing some more people to join us, to join the room. And I would like to invite you, whilst we wait to start, to introduce yourself, your company, and where you are joining today from, using the chat on the right-hand side. We always, enjoy to see the messages and get to know you a little bit better. And this is Belén Gallego reporting from Madrid today, from my house. Most people here are in their houses. And we will literally begin in 1 minute. Thank you. So welcome everyone. This is the capstone event for the MENA CSP Knowledge and Innovation Program, of which I've been a part of. I'm really, really proud and privileged to have been a part of this effort. And here in this capstone event yesterday, for those of you who were with us yesterday, we went through the financing, the policy making of CSP, amongst other topics. And today we're actually focusing and digging a little bit more into concentrating solar power specifically. So what we have today is actually a technical day, and is more on a seminar style. Just so that you know, for those of you who may not, originally this event was supposed to be obviously a face-to-face event in Tunis. However, due to the situation with the COVID, I think we're all now under house arrest. So therefore, we had to change pretty quickly into an online format. And I am really glad on the one hand that we have actually moved to this format, because I think many more people are able to listen to these great presentations and learn all of this information than probably could have been possible in a face-to-face event. But obviously the situation is the reason why we're in our homes is not a very good situation. So I'm hoping that all of you guys are safe wherever you are. So just before I introduce Michael Taylor, who is our first speaker for today, I just want to give you a little bit of an understanding of what are we going to be doing here. So here today, we're very technical, okay? We go in depth and we have presentations about driving cost reductions on CSP, in the case of Michael. We're also gonna have a case study on DAY2, which is a hybrid project that has CSP and PV to a total of 950 megawatts. We're going to look into getting a return on energy storage investments, also from IRENA, a little bit later on today. And finally, the final presentation for today is reducing technology risk in CSP development and operations, which is the final for today. So the way this is going to work is you're going to get a lengthy presentation, or a quite long presentation, followed by questions and answers. We have booked time for this. Yesterday was a panel session, so it was a little bit harder to see, how much time each of the speakers will take. But for today, we should have time. So please, to send your questions, just use the Q&A box at the bottom. The chat, use, to talk to other people. Make sure that you tag all panelists, all attendees, so we can all read it, not only us here in the panel. And for the rest, you're good to go and use the chat. But for your questions, use the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end of each of the sessions with each of the speakers. So this has been a really long introduction. Sorry about that. Just one more thing to tell you: we are recording the sessions, okay? And we will have the materials and the recordings available for you next week. We also have translation for this session in Arabic and in French. My colleague Manuel is actually going to send you now the instructions on how you can get all of this in French and Arabic interpreted live. Okay, you have to use a separate app, but you know it is available. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael Taylor, and I'd like to ask Michael to also share your screen, Michael, when you're ready, so that we can hear your presentation. And wow, I'm surprised there are people from Washington, there are people from from Madrid as well, but also from Australia. So welcome everyone. Please keep sharing. And go ahead, Michael, you're ready. We can see your presentation perfectly.
Great. Thank you very much, Belen, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be with you today. IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, has been working with the World Bank, assisting on advising on the cost reduction potential for CSP for a number of years now, and we're pleased to be here at this final capstone event. What I want to do today is take you through some of the work that the International Renewable Energy Agency has been doing, looking at the historical costs and performance of renewable energy technologies, and then some of the analysis that we've done looking at the cost reduction potential for CSP going forward to 2030. And this is a sneak peek actually of results that will be released later this year. So if you do have any feedback, we'd be delighted to have it. Perhaps before I launch into my presentation, just a quick statement about IRENA. We are, I think, still the newest intergovernmental organisation, even though we've been going for over 8 years now. We have a very simple mission, which is to accelerate in a sustainable manner all forms of renewable energy. And we do that for our around 160 member states. So we're going close to universal membership. So this work is for you. Right. So in terms of the work we do, I said we are going to share two components, our historical cost analysis and the forward-looking stuff. We do more or less on an annual basis now an update of historical cost evolution. This is released around May each year, so I'm showing you here the cover for last year's report. Basically, it looks into the cost and performance trends, so install costs, capacity factors, and levelized cost of electricity, and their underlying drivers. We look at country level data and global results. We try to dive a little bit into the underlying drivers of each of those components. So we do a detailed analysis of equipment costs and other drivers and performance drivers as well. We balance that kind of cost data with also the results from auction and PPA. That brings us different insights, important insights, and as a result, we get some new insights from that. There are a lot of caveats in respect of that data and how you analyze it, but that's in the, I don't propose to go into that here. You can look at that in the report. And we're releasing the latest data in 2019 data in May this year as well. And behind the charts, there's the data, of course, and you can download that from our website as well. So we're trying to be as transparent as possible. So what happened between 2010 and 2018? This is a chart of the levelized cost of electricity. Each circle represents a individual project, and the circle is the diameter of the circle is the size of the project to give you an idea of scale. The center of the circle is the levelized cost of electricity on the y-axis. And we have the projects for 2010 and 2018 from left to right: bioenergy, geothermal, hydro, solar PV, CSP, offshore, and then onshore wind. This is all calculated for a specific weighted average cost of capital, which is quite conservative, 7.5% for OECD and China and 10% for the rest of the world. So bear that in mind. As you can see on the left-hand side, the mature renewable power generation technologies have costs that are quite competitive, and at the bottom end of that almost pinkish range, which is the fossil fuel-fired cost range. When we look at solar PV, not a surprise to many of you, I'm sure, a significant reduction a dramatic reduction between 2010 and 2018. I should add that the lines on this chart represent the global weighted average values. So this is weighted by capacity. CSP falling from a higher level down to just outside the fossil fuel fired cost range in 2018, but obviously we need to remember that CSP is the least deployed of all of these technologies on the chart. Offshore wind coming down at costs as well, and future cost reductions coming. Onshore wind, very competitive now as well. So that's what's happened in recent times. So cost reductions tend to be continuous. So between 2017 and 2018, we saw cost reductions around 13% for solar PV and onshore wind. Offshore wind and CSP, because the markets are much thinner, we see much more volatility in the global weighted average. So for 2017 to 2018, CSP dropped significantly, but offshore wind not so much. But if we look at the results between 2010 and 2018, we see the very significant cost reduction for solar PV, but also for CSP, albeit from that lower level of deployment. So very significant cost reduction through time. And what this means is that for CSP at least, the market is thin, so there's very significant volatility, as I already mentioned. But the downward trend is quite clear. So what you have here in this chart is on the left-hand side, you have the total install costs. So again, some volatility depending on the year, given the thinness of the market. In the middle of the chart, you have the capacity factor, and we've seen that rising as we've seen both the technology improvements, particularly the increase in the amount of storage, but also shift into areas with higher solar resource. And as a result, the levelized cost of electricity has been coming down. I also mentioned that in addition to the project level cost data, which we collect, which is install cost, capacity factor, O&M, and the derivative of that, the LCOE, we also collect the data on the auctions and PPA results. Now, as I said, there are a lot of caveats in interpreting these two different metrics, and a PPA price or an auction price is not necessarily going to be equivalent to an LCOE. But if we remove some of the more glaring examples of where they're not very comparable, we can get some insights, a little crystal ball into the future. And you can see that here on the chart on the left-hand side, where we've overlaid. So in blue is the levelized cost of electricity data from our project level database. And we have around 17,000 renewable energy projects in total in that database. And then in orange is the auction and PPA database, which we have, which is somewhat smaller. It's around 10,000 projects at this point in time. But you can see with that, we can have a little crystal ball into the future. And for onshore wind and solar PV, we can look a few years ahead. With offshore wind and CSP, with the longer project development times, we get a little further into the future. And there you can see, when we look at this data, CSP, despite its very limited deployment compared to the others, has actually performed very well. But there's a lot more work to be done, obviously. So what's going on? What's driving these historical cost reductions? Obviously, we've seen a shift in the deployment through time to better quality resource areas, so highest direct normal irradiance. At the same time, project developers have gained a lot of experience in replicating these projects, driving down contingency margins, etc. We are seeing the benefits of greater competitiveness in the supply chains. There's a long way to go in that respect, and it is a function of the fact that the market is perhaps not growing anywhere as much as we'd like it to be. At the same time, we have technology improvements, which have been quite significant in terms of the projects which were commissioned in 2010 compared to 2018. And of course, we can't overlook the fact that competitive procurement is not only adding transparency to the market, but also ensuring that there is competition for development. Another important point has been the lower cost of capital that have been available, in particular for some of the recent projects and those that are being assisted by the World Bank and others. So all of that together brings us to the point where we are today, where CSP has fallen in cost significantly, but is not quite there yet, I think, in terms of where we'd like it to be. And that's a function, as I said, in many respects, of the fact that the market is not growing as much as we think it should, given that CSP is at a very early stage of development. We're talking about 6 gigawatts of capacity when PV is already looking around 600 gigawatts. So if we do see a scaling up in the market, we do see a significant cost reduction potential going forward to 2030, and that's what I'd like to share with you today. This analysis has been undertaken in support of the G20, so it's a little bit G20 focused, but given the analysis, it's quite relevant, I think. So this is an update of work that we did in 2016 that looked at cost reduction potential to 2025. We've pushed that out to 2030. And we've also gone from looking at global kind of reference case prices to individual G20 country analysis. The approach is to be a mix of techno-economic bottom-up analysis with top-down kind of learning curve analysis. And obviously, as I mentioned, in this case, we're looking at more country level insights to make it a bit more directly useful for policymakers. I think it's worthwhile explaining our cost reduction methodology and the partners that we've worked with on this. So as in 2016, we've worked with DLR here in Germany. I'm sitting in my home here in Bonn with the sun shining nicely. And DLR has their offices just up the road at the airport here. And we've worked with them to do the detailed simulation of the CSP plants. And that's important because what we've done in terms of process is define a reference plant, a state-of-the-art technology for 2018 commissioning. We're then screening all the technological and, if you like, market factors and innovations, which will define not only the technical characteristics of a 2030 plant, but also their costs as a result. And then what we've done is for each of the G20 countries where DNI is sufficiently high that it merits an economic prospect for CSP is there, we've identified specific sites to extract the meteorological data for the typical year. And using that, we've basically simulated for our reference plant, or DLR has for us, simulated and optimized the plant design and in particular solar field size for that particular site and technology. And we're just looking at PTC, so parabolic trough, and solar tower as the two likely most commercial products that will be deployed by 2030, allowing, of course, for the fact that more innovative solutions may be emerging. Once we have the solar field size, we have the overall plant configuration for that location in the country, and then we then define the local content shares. So our reference plant is a benchmarked plant, and then we have a price index to adjust Then finally, at the end, we can do our yield analysis for the LCOE. So I thought it was useful to take you through that methodology, spend a little bit of time on it. And now I'm just going to cherry pick a few of these processes to talk to you about what's happening. So here we're in stage 3 of the process that I talked about to you previously. What we've done is identified overall the cost reduction potential, taking into account the technological changes we expect by 2030 and the improvements, if you like, in supply chain competitiveness and so on. And what we see is we're looking at around a 31 to say 35% reference plant cost reduction, installed cost, by 2030. There's a number of drivers going on there, and we can talk about that in a minute. But the solar field is an area where a lot of the action is happening. So what we've done is looked at it with DLR by cost component. So we've taken our generic plant configuration for both of these and established cost benchmarks for each of the components within the plant. And then we've looked, again, using a mix of bottom-up techno-economic analysis, in some cases learning curves, where we have time series data, to come up with what can happen to each of these. And you can see here for the solar field at the top, it's a bit hard to see perhaps read the individual components, but on the left-hand side we have parabolic trough, and on the right-hand side we have solar thermal. Our reference plant in 2030 for parabolic trough is using a molten salt heat transfer fluid, achieving significantly higher operating temperatures, allowing for some cost economies. But then there is a cascade of small components that come into play, which will all see some cost reductions. The overall level of costs for solar field storage today is much lower, given their higher operating temperatures. And so we see a different mix driving the cost reduction to 2030. And below that, sorry, I should have clicked once more time. On the bottom there, this is where I'm talking about the thermal energy storage. And you can see here on the left-hand side, the large red cost reduction component for PTC, the benefit of that much higher operating temperature, reducing the thermal storage cost for that system, which was, I should also have mentioned that for PTC plants, our reference plant has 7 hours of storage, and the solar thermal plant has, solar tower plant has 10 hours. Whether that's already much higher operating temperature, there's less cost reduction potential for solar towers, but still some there. And by 2030, as a result of this convergence in operating temperature, we see a convergence in the cost as well, although still a cost advantage to solar towers. Now, I mentioned that in process 5 and 6, we determine the site-specific solar field costs, and that's with a reference plant cost structure. And that is, this chart tries to show this, but basically what it's saying is that depending on if you're a relatively low local cost component area relative to our benchmark, the solar field costs will come down. So you'll go from, on this chart, from blue to red downwards. And if you're in a predominantly higher than average cost market for our benchmark, then the solar field costs will go up somewhat. Right? So this adds a little bit more granularity to the results, somewhat more realistic cost estimates at a country level. And obviously is heavily dependent on not only the storage size we've just defined for our plant, but also the field size that drops out of that given the solar resource. And then as a result, we can end up with this local content share component impacting and then imports. What this means is that for a standard configuration, this actually ends up being a wide range of costs, benchmark costs, depending on the country. And this is not going to be surprising to anyone. Basically, OECD countries have higher overall costs because of the local content. Costs are somewhat higher than the average going forward. It's an approach which is limited to some extent by the quality of the price index we use to adjust local content value. So it is to be taken as, with a grain of salt, I would say. And what happens then if we take, once we've gone through this cascade of the methodology, when we've looked at the cost reduction drivers, what we see is there's very significant continued cost reduction potential for CSP out to 2030. This is the chart for the levelized cost of electricity, again, assuming 7.5% weighted average cost of capital, so quite conservative, for solar towers. And you can see in potentially when we start to look at Saudi Arabia with very excellent solar resources and very good civil engineering infrastructure, you can see very low costs, below potentially 5 cents per kilowatt hour in 2030. And in other countries, we're basically falling into the 5 to 10 cent per cost range. Critically, of course, if you think that the projects can achieve a lower weighted average cost of capital, these values will come down below that. So in terms of what's driving the cost reduction at the levelized cost of electricity level, there is a, if you like, a number of small components that we talked about earlier that are impacting the result. I mean, overall, we're talking about significant contributions from the technology improvements that we'll see by 2030, whether that's higher operating temperatures for parabolic trough, lower costs for towers and receivers in the solar towers, and so on. And also the increased competition in supply chain. This is predicated on a pathway for the power generation sector, which is consistent with the Paris Agreement. So scaling up the CSP industry to at least 300 gigawatts by 2050. So there's an issue of scale here, which helps increase competition in supply chain and indeed among developers. To generalize, very important contributions for parabolic trough from reductions in solar field costs and from the thermal energy storage costs. The latter obviously strongly driven by the increased operating temperatures. Again, for solar towers, the heliostat field, the cost reduction is very important, as well as the receiver and also the indirect EPC costs as we see scale and more experience in developing them. So there's a chain of contributors to this cost reduction, but we think that they're both reasonable from a technological perspective and also from an economic supply chain perspective. So that was a very quick overview of our results for the historical cost data and our forward-looking one. And basically, we think that CSP is a very important contributor to the overall decarbonisation of the power sector. And as we know, that's becoming increasingly important to the decarbonisation of the energy sector full stop through increased electrification and potentially the use of hydrogen in other end uses. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions.
Hi, Michael. So we have a bunch of questions for you. So if that's okay, I'm just going to go for them. Let's see. Well, this, I don't know if you can answer, but do you have a chart showing comparison with fossil fuel power technologies? It may be on the report.
No, but essentially, so if you look at this chart, we show a range between 0 and 15 cents per kilowatt hour. For new capacity, in the G20 countries, the fossil fuel-fired cost range, whether you're talking about baseload or mid-merit, ranges from about 4.7 cents for a coal-fired plant in China to say 17 cents per kilowatt hour for a gas-fired plant longer term at say a 50 to 60% capacity factor in an area relying on LNG imports. So basically, if we can get the value down to 5 cents, as you can see here for, say, Saudi Arabia and very close for others, you're talking about being competitive with base load power from a fossil fuel-fired option. That's before you consider, of course, that fossil fuels are not paying for their externalities. So if you were to add so for instance, we've made a calculation. If you take into account the climate change costs and outdoor pollution costs, so the loss of life and health costs from outdoor pollution from fossil fuels, that equates to $95 per tonne of CO2. So you can imagine what impact that would have on our 4.7 cents per kilowatt hour for a coal-fired plant in China if you were actually doing a cost analysis at that point.
God, that's like a huge point. Did you said 95?
Yeah, $95 per tonne. It's mostly the health costs from the external pollution, actually, around 2/3.
Okay, here there is a question about onshore wind, but I think the number is wrong. It says $1,500 per kilowatt.
Yes. Well, okay. So today's global average is around 1,500. So a lower value is, yeah, it's going to be lower than that for 2025, 2035. So I can't remember off the top of my head where we arrived at for the onshore wind, because we're doing this analysis for solar PV, onshore and offshore wind as well. So it will come out together with the CSP cost reduction. But $1,500 per kilowatt hour would be a high cost market in those periods.
Okay, let me see. Do you have a report coming out about electrical energy storage costs?
So my colleagues will talk about this afternoon with you about storage valuation. We released a report a couple of years ago now that has not been updated on battery storage costs. And there's actually an Excel tool with it as well, which people might find quite useful. And I will give you the link to that, Belen.
Perfect. You can put it in the chat. And
yeah. Okay, but yes, we would love to be able to update that analysis, given that things have moved quite significantly. A little bit less for stationary storage than obviously for electric vehicle batteries, but it would be great to update that. But unfortunately, we don't have the resources to do that at the moment. So we're hoping someone will come forward with funding for that.
Emma here is asking, what is the component or components most responsible for this cost reduction?
Yeah, so at the level of the electricity consumption, it's very hard to see here, I think, but basically, you know, for parabolic trough, for instance, 1/3 is coming simply from the solar field cost reduction, and 17% from the thermal storage cost component. And the fact that we're generalizing the larger collector size as well, and the temperature increase obviously helps with the efficiency of the generation. So it's a number of components, but those are the main ones. For the solar towers, it's very much again in the heliostat field, so 24% coming there. Reduction in drive costs as well, the receiver cost and tower. So there's, you know, with the scaling up of the sector, there's a lot of supply chain efficiencies that could be unlocked. And, you know, from having higher volumes and, you know, as a result, lower margins, and also competition. You know, having greater competition will assist enormously in driving down costs.
Okay, I'm just going to do one more question and then we're just going to have to move on because of time, sadly.
Sure.
There was here a question from Fengli, and I'm just going to make a little bit of a mashup for a couple of questions. One,
sure.
She asks, have you compared the economics of CSP and PV with 10 hours storage, which is very in line to what we're discussing next, actually? And why, if it's so competitive, why do you think, CSP deployment is so slow?
Yeah, okay, so we haven't done a direct comparison of CSP with solar PV with an equivalent amount of storage. My guess is that, my guess is that it would be very favorable for CSP, basically because of the long duration. The key advantage of CSP is the very low cost of long duration storage. As you people might be aware, there is, if you like, the power and energy component of batteries are not completely independent. So effectively a battery system, today's lithium ion battery system, you have a kind of energy to power ratio of about 4, right? So you might have 4 megawatt hours for a 1 megawatt capacity battery. So if you're looking to have 10 hours of storage, which CSP can do, you're looking at having not just, one battery, but you're going to have a capacity that is 2.5 times as large, right? So, and if you put that at say $350 per kilowatt hour, then, the costs start to add up very quickly. So I think the important thing is if you're going to figure out what you need, you can't really cheat. You have to simulate the electricity system into which you want to achieve greater decarbonisation. We see a very strong role for all of the technologies because they're complementary. They fill different parts of what is a time-dependent problem, right? So there's a role for, sorry.
Just one more question, actually, Michael. On the line of what you were saying now, someone here has asked, and I thought, I want to ask you this, actually. We're already hearing, LCOE values in the range of 5 or 6 cents kilowatt hour now, which are closer to your predictions from 2030. This was yesterday, some of the... Yeah. So what did you think about that?
Exactly, which is why I mentioned several times that there's a weighted average cost of capital assumption of 7.5%. So I knew someone would ask this, so I have a slide actually. Let's see if I can't advance.
You have slides for everything, Michael.
Here we go. Here we go. All right. So this is a chart that an analysis we did, which is, do not take this as gospel. But it's how we think the breakdown works. So if on the left-hand side, you can see here basically our reference plant cost for a PTC, 7.5% capital, cost of capital, 25 years economic life, around 13 cents per kilowatt hour. On the right-hand side, you have the reported DWA price, right? So 7 cents. Yeah. So what happens if we? Okay, so there's a slight increase if we want to look at the DWA one because we have it's a blended project, so costs go up a little bit because of the tower, but then we have a 35-year PPA, so that helps bring things down. There's already a cost reduction that's continuing to occur by the time it needs to be deployed, so there's a small benefit there. But the big difference is the cost of finance, right? So the weighted average cost of capital is probably about 4%, and that accounts for the majority of the difference. And then there's some additional benefit from the economies of scale, obviously, of that project, which are unlikely to see anywhere else. So when you do take all that into consideration, and there will be a chart, for instance, in the report. No, I didn't include it. No, sorry, I didn't include it in my slides, but there's actually a chart that'll be in the report that shows the cost, the LCOE for different cost of capital assumptions, so that you can get a better idea. But basically, because of the the fact that CSP and the other solar PV and onshore wind are essentially capital intensive projects with very low O&M costs and zero fuel costs in many cases. The cost of capital matters hugely. So, and as a related point, we're actually going to start a project this year to fill a gap in our knowledge in terms of what the cost of RE, cost of capital is. So we'll be launching an expert elicitation to get a better understanding of what actual weighted average cost of capital is for different technologies and different markets, because it's one of the few things that it's very difficult to actually collect data for.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Michael. This is sadly all we have time for today. We could probably spend a lot of more time chatting to you. So thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to stop sharing the screen, and to my colleagues on the technical side to put up the transition slide. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Yes, send the clubs, virtual clubs, since we're not in an event. And I'm going to now, we're going to